Yahweh-Nissi Ministries presents Table Talk with Torah, honoring the Hebraic roots of the faith, with your host, Sonia Anderson. Welcome to Yahweh-Nissi Ministries Table Talk with Torah. Today's topic is Understanding the Salt Covenant. This is part 1, Background and Historical Context. I'm your host, Sonia Anderson. Today's talking points are: how do we enter the Salt Covenant? What are some examples of the Salt Covenant? The origins of it, in what way the Salt Covenant is violated, and the cultural foundations. We have 3 key verses for today's topic. The first one is coming from Numbers chapter 18, verse 19, and it states, "All of the offerings of the holy things which the Israelites offered to Yahweh, I have given to you and to your sons and daughters with you as a continual allotment. It is an everlasting covenant of salt that cannot be dissolved or violated before Yahweh, to you and to your descendants with you." The second one is coming from Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, which says, "You shall season every grain offering with salt, so that the salt preservation of the covenant of your Elohim will not be missing from your grain offering. You shall offer salt with your offerings." And the last one from 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 5, which says, "Do you not know that Yahweh, God of Israel, gave rule over Israel forever to David and to his sons by a covenant of salt, a permanent pact extending to each generation of Israel?" So our definitions for the word covenant include an agreement between 2 or more people to act together in order to accomplish a task or a pledge. The Hebrew word for covenant is berith, which means an alliance, agreement, ordinance, or treaty as pertaining to friendship, marriage, or other types of partners. It also means to cut. And the Greek word for covenant is diatheke, which is a set agreement with terms. It is a promise, arrangement, or a compact. So what is the covenant of salt? It is an everlasting agreement that Yahweh has entered into with man. It's also known as the covenant of bread and salt. Once entered into, it cannot be changed or altered. It is mentioned only 3 times in the Bible in those 3 verses that I read. Those were our key verses. And the key verses reference when Yahweh covenanted with Aaron and his seed in the priesthood, when Yahweh covenanted with King David and his seed in the kingship, and when Yahweh covenanted with his people in all of their holy offerings. The origins of the salt covenant. In ancient times, salt was highly valued. At one point, its distribution was controlled by the government. If you received salt from the government, you were considered to be bound to that government via a loyal oath. So biblical examples in Ezra 4:14, I'm actually going to read 4:14 through 16 for context. "Now, because we are in the service of the palace, and it is not proper for us to witness the king's dishonor, for that reason we have sent word and informed the king, in order that a search may be made in the record books of your fathers, and you will discover in the record books and learn that this is a rebellious city, damaging to kings and provinces, and that in the past they have incited rebellion within it. That is why that city was laid waste or destroyed. We are informing the king that if the city is rebuilt and its walls finished, it will mean that you will have no possession in the province west of the Euphrates rivers." So here we have people who proclaim that they are in the service of the palace, which means they receive bread and salt from the palace, so they cannot witness the king's dishonor. They actually have to stay on the side of the king because they receive bread and salt from the palace. So receiving salt and partaking of it with another person or a group is either an establishment of the salt covenant or a renewal of the salt covenant. Bread and salt. Generally, the covenant of salt is entered into with a shared meal of bread and salt. An ancient Arabian proverb states, "My bread had no salt in it," which actually means there was an act of treachery somewhere. It also indicates a lack of hospitality. In the same culture, salt is also used to represent a token of friendship. Salt representing blood. Covenantal principles allow for salt and blood to be interchangeable as they are both crucial to life. So when blood is unavailable, salt is commonly used in its place. Consider modern medicine. When a blood transfusion is unavailable, saline injections are used in its place. When an animal is slaughtered in a kosher fashion, the blood is drained and the meat heavily salted in order to draw out remaining blood. We have Deuteronomy 12:23 here, which tells us, only be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life or soul, and you shall not eat the life with the meat. And then we have Leviticus 19, verse 26, which states, you shall not eat anything with the blood, nor practice divination using omens or witchcraft or soothsaying. Now, the reason why I put those two in is because there are certain cultures when salt is not available, they will use fresh blood from a freshly slaughtered animal and incorporate that into their diet, whether as a drink or a sauce or any of the like. And the reason why is because that is one way to include salt in the diet. But we are clearly cautioned against that in scripture. It is not kosher. It is not clean for us. So we are clearly cautioned against that. The blood represents life. So we are to avoid drinking blood. Salt replacing blood. When it comes to Holy Communion, during the 2nd century, there were Ebionite and Elkosites who refrained from wine, and in its replacement, they actually used salt. Their communion consisted of bread and salt rather than bread and wine, and that was sufficient to establish the covenant. Salt as an agency of health. 2 Kings verses 19 through 22. It states, the men of the city said to Elisha, look, this city is in a pleasant place, as my lord Elisha sees, but the water is bad and the land barren. He said, bring me a new jar and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. Then Elisha went to the spring of water and threw the salt in it and said, thus says Yahweh, I, not the salt, have purified and healed the waters. There shall no longer be death or barrenness because of it. So the waters have been purified to this day in accordance with the words spoken to Elisha. So we see here that salt is used as an agency of health and purification for these waters. This parallels other customs, ancient customs, as we're looking at today, and it also references another verse in scripture. In Asian cultures, salting a newborn is done to promote life and wisdom and health. And we read an example of this in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 4, which states, and as for your birth, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water for cleansing, nor were you rubbed with salt or even wrapped in cloths. This connects to a primitive Asian custom where once you give a child a name, at that same ceremony, they dip a newborn baby 2 or 3 times in salted water. Salt can also represent wisdom. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, it tells us, let your speech at all times be gracious and pleasant, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how to answer each one who questions you. This parallels with our modern day concept of addict salt. In the dictionary, addict salt is described as a dry, delicate wit. Cultural foundations in the covenant of salt. In Arabian culture, the salt alliance is a token of friendship. So in order to declare peace with a potential enemy, bread dipped in salt is partaken of together. After that, there is a peace treaty that cannot ever be broken. Turks and Tartars, the salt covenant represents a compact of trust. Baron Tutat, a Hungarian French traveler, in his memoir, wrote that he shared bread and salt with the Molzovani Pasha, and he did so in order to assure him that he can be relied upon and trusted. Cultural foundations in a covenant of salt. In India, Palestine, and Persia, there's a story in the Mahabharata that affirms allegiance via the covenant of salt. In this story, permission was requested to fight against the Kauravas, and it was denied because the soldiers had already eaten bread and salt of the Kauravas and was obligated to stand with them in allegiance. In Bedouin culture, a binding oath of faithfulness. The salt covenant is entered into when salt is sprinkled on bread and then exchanged, and they also share an oath stating, by the right of bread and salt, I will not betray you. And afterwards, the two parties are considered family or blood related, and then the oath may never be broken. Entering into the salt covenant. The covenant of salt is entered into by ingesting salt. An ancient Asian custom is to drink salted water with the person who you wish to covenant with, and then afterwards an oath is entered into. And it may be established by sharing a meal of bread and salt, and then you can exchange a verbal oath at that time. Salt alone is required for entering the salt covenant. Bread alone does not qualify. Bread is commonly used as a vehicle for which salt is partaken. just like water. However, simply licking salt from the palm of your hand is sufficient for entering the salt covenant. Modern examples of the salt covenant. In the text, Survey of Western Palestine, John McGregor recounts the story of his imprisonment by Arabs. He tricked the chief into tasting salt. Meanwhile, he simultaneously put some salt into his mouth as well. And once he informed the chief that it was salt, the chief had no choice but to declare peace and set McGregor free due to the bonds of the salt covenant, which he actually did. In Western weddings today, there's an exchange of salt between the bride and groom in order to signify a new covenant connection. And at Queen Elizabeth's table, it was an ancient custom to rub bread and salt on each plate before meals were served. Violating the salt covenant. In ancient Persia, the word traitor is namakaram, which means one who is faithless to salt. In Bedouin culture, you are actually considered an abuser of salt if you break an agreement. Let's take a look at this painting by Leonardo da Vinci. It's entitled The Last Supper, and you might be familiar with it. It was completed in 1498. This is the entire painting here. And if you look, we have Yeshua and all of his disciples, but you cannot tell who the traitor is in this painting unless you take a very close examination. So up here, this is a close-up of a section of the painting, and we see that the traitor is identified because the traitor has spilled salt. Now, if you look here, here's a little salt shaker. It is spilled over. This is salt spilled out on the table. And also we have a bag of money. So now we know that this has to be Judas, the betrayer, because of the spilled salt. Sodom and Gomorrah and the salt covenant. Well, let's take a look at the story of Lot and his wife and family and how they exited Sodom and Gomorrah. More specifically, why Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt for looking backward. So a brief account of some of the events that occurred in Sodom and Gomorrah is found in Genesis chapter 19. I'm actually going to pull that up and read that now. It was evening when the two angels came to Sodom. Lot was sitting at Sodom's city gate. Seeing them, Lot got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And he said, "See here, my lords, please turn aside and come into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may get up early and go on your way." But they said, "No, we shall spend the night in the open plaza of the city." However, Lot strongly urged them, so they turned aside and entered his house. And he prepared a feast for them with wine and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down to sleep, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house, all the men from every quarter, and they called out to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them intimately." But Lot went out of the doorway to the men and shut the door after him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not do something so wicked. See here, I have two daughters who have not known a man intimately. Please let me bring them out to you instead, and you can do as you please with them. Only do nothing to these men, because they have in fact come under the shelter of my roof for protection." But they said, "Get out of the way." And they said, "This man Lot came as an outsider to live here temporarily, and now he is acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than your visitors." So they rushed forward and pressed violently against Lot and came close to breaking down the door of his house. But the men, the angels, reached out with their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door after him. They punished the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, from the young men to the old men, so that they exhausted themselves trying to find the doorway. And the two men or angels asked Lot, "Have you any others here in Sodom, a son-in-law and your sons and your daughters? Whomever you have in the city, take them out of here, for we are destroying this place, because the outcry for judgment against them has grown so great before Yahweh that Yahweh has sent us in to destroy and ruin it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were betrothed and legally promised to marry his daughters and said, "Get up, get out of this place, for Yahweh is about to destroy the city." But to his sons-in-law, he appeared to be joking. When the morning dawned, the angel urged Lot to hurry, saying, "Get up, take your wife and two daughters who are here, and go, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But Lot hesitated and lingered. The men took hold of his hand and the hand of his wife and the hands of his two daughters, because Yahweh was merciful to him for Abraham's sake. And they brought him out and left him outside the city with his family. When they had brought them outside, one of the angels said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you or stop anywhere in the entire valley. Escape to the mountains of Moab, or you will be consumed and swept away." But Lot said to them, "Oh, no, not that place, my lords. Please listen. Your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, mercy to me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains because the disaster will overtake me and I will be killed. Now look, this town in the distance is near enough for us to flee to, and it is small with only a few people. Please let me escape there. Is it not small? So that my life will be saved." And the angel said to him, "Behold, I grant you this request also. I will not destroy the town in which you have spoken. Hurry, take refuge there, for I cannot do anything to punish Sodom until you arrive there." For this reason, the town was named Zoar, few and small. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then Yahweh rained down brimstone, flaming sulfur, and fire on Sodom and on Gomorrah from Yahweh out of heaven, and he overthrew, demolished, or ended these cities. He overthrew, demolished, and ended those cities and the entire valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and whatever grew on the ground. But Lot's wife from behind him, foolishly looking back towards Sodom in an act of disobedience, and she became a pillar of salt. Abraham started out early the next morning to the place where he only the day before had stood before Yahweh, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward the land of the valley of the Dead Sea, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a kiln or pottery furnace. Now when Yahweh ravished and destroyed the cities of the plain of Siddim, he remembered Abraham, and for that reason he sent Abraham's nephew Lot out of the midst of the destruction when he destroyed the cities in which Lot had lived. So I'm going to stop here at verse 29, when Yahweh just destroyed all the cities in which Lot had lived. And we see that Sodom and Gomorrah had done enough for Yahweh to eradicate them from off the face of the earth. But what we don't have is a more comprehensive story. We don't have a lot of the details of what they did. We don't have Lot's wife's name, why he selected a pillar of salt as a punishment, or any of those things. So Yeshua warns us to remember what happened to Lot's wife in Luke chapter 17, verse 32. But why would he do this? We can look up a more comprehensive account in the ancient historical text of Jasher, chapter 19. We discover here that her name was Adu, and that she looked back because her daughters remained in Sodom and Gomorrah and did not go with them. So she was actually moved with compassion for her children, mourning and grieving the loss of them. They were dying in that flame. She knew they would die in the flames. And as the city was going up in destruction, she was sorrowful, and she looked back and consequently turned into a pillar of salt. But the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were guilty of breaking the salt covenant. The pillar of salt in Yeshua's warning is a lasting reminder of this. Remember, when we enter into the salt covenant, it is a covenant that cannot be altered or broken. It is a compact treaty, a covenant of friendship or token of friendship. It is also one of peace, and it is one that declares you as blood-related family. I'm going to read Jasher chapter 19 so that we get a more comprehensive account of what happened in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the cities of Sodom had 4 judges to 4 cities, and these were their names: Sirach and the city of Sodom, Sharkad and Gomorrah, Zabnach and Admah, and Menon and Zeboim. And Eleazar, Abraham's servant, applied them to different names, and he converted Sirach to Shakra, Sharkad to Shakrua, Zebnach to Kezobim, and Menon to Matzladin. And by desire of their 4 judges, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah had beds erected in the streets of the city. And if a man came to these places, they laid hold of him and brought him to one of their beds, and by force made him to lie in them. And as he lay down, 3 men would stand at his head and 3 at his feet, and measure him by the length of the bed. And if the man was less than the bed, these 6 men would stretch at each end. And when he cried out to them, they would not answer him. And if he was longer than the bed, then they would draw together the 2 sides of the bed at each end until the man had reached the gates of death. And if he continued to cry out to them, they would answer him, saying, "Thus shall it be done to a man that comes into our land." And when the men heard all these things that the people of the cities of Sodom did, they refrained from coming there. So that's crime number 1, the crime of hospitality, which breaks the salt covenant. they were torturing the men that came in and torturing them in a fashion that's really despicable, to be honest. So we read the first crime of them torturing people who came into the city. And this was a profound lack of hospitality and certainly breaking the covenant of salt. So picking up at verse number 8, and when a poor man came into their land, they would give him silver and gold and cause a proclamation in the whole city not to give him a morsel of bread to eat. And if the stranger should remain there for some days and die from hunger, not having been able to obtain a morsel of bread, then at his death, all the people of the city would come and take their gold and silver, which they had given him. And those that could recognize the gold and silver which they had given him took it back. And at his death, they also stripped him of his garments, and they would fight about them. And he that prevailed over his neighbor took them. They would after that carry him and bury him under some of the shrubs in the deserts. So they did all the days to anyone that came to them and died in their land. And in the course of time, Sarah sent Eliezer to Sodom to see Lot and inquire after his welfare. Okay, so the second crime here is with the poor. They are torturing the poor people who come into the city. A profound lack of hospitality is seen again as they gave this poor person money. And can you imagine being very, very poor, coming into a city and people are showering you with money? Well, that's what they were doing. But then you're not able to buy anything because the law states that you cannot sell food to the poor. So this man eventually dies, and then they basically take back all the money that they'd given him. So it's like a false hope that they're giving these people. Definitely a lack of hospitality and breaking of the salt covenant. So I'm going to pick up here at verse 12. After Sarah, Abraham's wife, sends Eliezer to Sodom to see about their nephew Lot. And Eliezer went to Sodom, and he met a man of Sodom fighting with a stranger. And the man of Sodom stripped the poor man of all his clothes and went away. And this poor man cried to Eliezer and supplicated his favor on account of what the man of Sodom had done to him. And he said to him, "Why do you act this way to the poor man who came to your land?" And the man of Sodom answered Eliezer, saying, "Is this man your brother? Or have the people of Sodom made you a judge this day, and you speak about this man?" And Eleazar strove with the man of Sodom on account of the poor man. And when Eleazar approached to recover the poor man's clothes from the man of Sodom, he hastened with the stone and smote Eleazar in the forehead. And the blood flowed copiously from Eleazar's forehead. And when the man saw the blood, he caught hold of Eleazar, saying, "Give me my hire for having rid thee of this bad blood that was in your forehead, for it is the custom and the law in our land." And Eleazar said to him, "You have wounded me, and then you want me to pay you your hire?" And Eleazar wouldn't listen to the words of the man of Sodom. And the man laid hold of Eleazar and brought him to Shachar, the judge of Sodom, for judgment. And the man spoke to the judge, saying, "I beseech you, my lord, this is what this man has done. I hit him with a stone so that the blood flowed from his forehead, and he is unwilling to give me my hire." And the judge said to Eleazar, "This man speaks the truth to you. Give him his hire, for this is the custom in our land." And Eleazar heard the words of the judge, and he lifted up a stone and smote the judge, and the stone struck on his forehead, and the blood flowed copiously from the forehead of the judge. And Eleazar said, "If this then is the custom in your land, then give unto this man what I should have given him, for this has been your decision, and you did decree it." And Eleazar left the man of Sodom with the judge, and he went away. And when the kings of Elam had made war with the kings of Sodom, the kings of Elam captured all the property of Sodom, and they took Lot captive with his property. And when it was told to Abraham, he went and made war with the kings of Elam, and he recovered from their hands all the property of Lot, as well as the property of Sodom. Okay, so this second story is actually kind of crazy. Poor Eleazar has entered into Sodom not knowing what to expect. He is assaulted upon entrance and is bleeding copiously, which is a significant amount of blood. But the man who attacks him states, "You have to give me money for this because I have allowed you to get rid of bad blood." This goes all the way to court. In the court of law, the judge actually affirms, yes, this is the law and custom in the land of Sodom, that you are to pay people when they assault you and allow you to get rid of this bad blood. So Eleazar just assaults the judge and causes him to bleed. So, "Well, you give him the money then. You just said this is your custom." So here we have another example of Sodom and Gomorrah definitely violating the SALT covenant. Remember, it was also a compact for treaty and hospitality and those things. And on top of that, just being quite cruel, and cruelty is actually the law. I'm going to pick up at verse 24. Lot is now having a daughter named Paltith. At that time, the wife of Lot bare him a daughter. He called her name Paltith, saying, because Yahweh had delivered him and his whole household from the kings of Elam. And Paltith, daughter of Lot, grew up, and one of the men of Sodom took her for a wife. And a poor man came into the city to seek a maintenance, and he remained in the city some days. And all the people of Sodom caused a proclamation of their custom not to give this man a morsel of bread to eat until he dropped dead on the earth, and they did so. And Paltith, the daughter of Lot, saw this man lying in the streets, starved with hunger, and no one would give him anything to keep him alive, and he was just upon the point of death. And her soul was filled with pity on account of the man, and she fed him secretly with bread for many days, and the soul of this man was revived. But when she went forth to fetch water, she would put the bread in the water pitcher. And when she came to the place where the poor man was, she took the bread from the pitcher and gave it to him to eat. And so she did this for many days. And all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah wondered how this man could bear starvation for so many days. And they said to each other, this can only be that he eats and drinks, for no man can bear starvation for so many days or live as this man has without even his countenance changing. And the three men concealed themselves in a place where the poor man was stationed, to know who it was that brought him bread to eat. And Paltith, the daughter of Lot, went forth that day to fetch water. And she put bread into her pitcher of water, and she went in to draw water by the poor man's place. And she took out the bread from the pitcher and gave it to the poor man, and he ate it. And the three men saw what Paltith did to the poor man, and they said to her, is it you then who has supported him, and therefore has not starved, nor changed in appearance, nor died like the rest? And the three men went out of the place in which they were concealed, and they seized Paltith and the bread which was in the poor man's hand. And they took Paltith and brought her before their judges, and they said to them, thus did she do, and it is she who supplied the poor man with bread. Therefore, he did not die all this time. Now, therefore, declare to us the punishment due this woman for having transgressed our law. And the people of Sodom and Gomorrah assembled and kindled a fire in the street of the city, and they took the woman and cast her into the fire, as she was burned to ashes. Okay, so here we have a woman who her heart is moved with compassion. This is Lot's daughter, Paltith. She feeds a homeless man. She feeds a poor beggar on the street, bread and salt. Now, according to the law in Sodom and Gomorrah, he's supposed to just be left to die, and no one's supposed to feed him anything. When they find out she did this, they kill her. The law to not be hospitable to or feed the homeless or help the poor is punishable by the death penalty. Let's think about that. On top of that, when Paltith was giving this man bread, all bread recipes have salt in it. She was actually entering into the salt covenant with this man, and he became her family. And it's a friendship covenant and a covenant of hospitality. So they broke all of that in Sodom because they made it against the law, and then they killed her for doing that. So I'm picking up in verse 36, and we read another story of a woman who died for similar reasons. And in the city of Admah, there was a woman to whom they did the like. For a traveler came into the city of Admah to abide there all night with the intention of going home in the morning. And he sat opposite the door of the house of the young woman's father to remain there, as the sun had set when he had reached that place. And the young woman saw him sitting by the door of the house. And he asked her for a drink of water. And she said to him, who are you? And he said to her, I was this day going on the road and reached here when the sun set. So I will abide here all night. And in the morning I will arise early and continue my journey. And the young woman went into the house and fetched the man bread and water to eat and drink. And this affair became known to the people of Admah, and they assembled and brought the young woman before the judges that they should judge her for this act. And the judge said, the judgment of death must pass upon this woman because she transgressed our law. And this, therefore, is the decision concerning her. And the people of those cities assembled and brought out the young woman and anointed her with honey from head to foot, as the judge had decreed, and they placed her before a swarm of bees, which were in their hives, and the bees flew upon her and stung her so that her whole body was swelled. And the young woman cried out on account of the bees, but no one took notice of her or pitied her, and her cries ascended to heaven. Okay. This here is cruelty beyond belief, and I don't really have to explain that. I mean, it's just mean, right? And the unfortunate thing is the people who are receiving the death penalty are receiving it for reasons that they should not be. This was also Lot's daughter who married a man from Sodom. I'm going to pick up at verse 44. And Yahweh was provoked at this and all the works of the cities of Sodom, for they had an abundance of food and had tranquility among them, and still would not sustain the poor and needy. And in those days, their evil doings and sins became great before Yahweh. There it is. That's why he destroyed them. They had an abundance and refused to share. And Yahweh sent for two of the angels that had come to Abraham's house to destroy Sodom and its cities. And the angels rose up from the door of Abraham's tent after they had eaten and drunk, and they reached Sodom in the evening, and Lot was then sitting in the gate of Sodom. And when he saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed down to the ground. And he pressed them greatly and brought them into his house, and he gave them victuals, which they ate and abode all night in his house. And the angel said to Lot, Arise, go forth from this place, you and all that belongs to you, unless you be consumed in the iniquity of this city, for Yahweh will destroy this place. And the angels laid hold upon the hand of Lot, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hands of his children, and all belonging to him, and they brought him forth and set him without the cities. And they said to Lot, Escape for your life, and he fled, and all that belongs to him. Then Yahweh rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and upon all these cities, brimstone and fire from Yahweh out of heaven. And he overthrew the cities and all the plain, and the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. And Adu, the wife of Lot, looked back to see the destruction of the cities, for her compassion was moved on the account of her daughters who remained in Sodom, for they did not go with her. And when she looked back, she became a pillar of salt, and it is yet in that place unto this day. And the oxen which stood in that place daily licked up the salt to the extremities of their feet, and in the morning it would spring forth afresh, and they again licked it up to this day. And Lot and two of his daughters that remained with him fled and escaped to the cave of Adullam, and they remained there for some time. I'm actually going to stop there at verse 55. There's like 5 more verses left, but this is why Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. When she looked back onto Sodom and Gomorrah, it was like covenanting with them, like siding with Sodom and Gomorrah, because Yahweh basically said, choose. You're choosing to go forward. Do not look back. Choose to go forward. When she looked back, she chose Sodom and Gomorrah. They were guilty of breaking the salt covenant multiple times over. Remember, it is also one of hospitality. It's also one of friendship, multiple things. And she was punished severely for breaking that salt covenant, breaking that agreement by looking backward. But Sodom and Gomorrah, my goodness, there's a lot more going on than what Genesis 19 tells us, which is why it's important to do your research and look up some other ancient historical texts. Again, this is the book of Jasher, chapter 19. Of course, there's more in here, but that is the meat of the story, right? That is the meat of the story, that they were very cruel. They were punishing people for no reason, no good reason. They were punishing people for no good reason. Other customs connected to the salt covenant. The Kuki people of India, when a courier is sent with a life or death message, a little salt is placed in his or her hand. In academia and prominent universities such as Oxford and Stratford, it is actually customary to salt a student who finished their freshman year, and salt was partaken of during this ceremony as well. It's called salting a freshman. It ended in the early 20th century, but it was a very common thing to do in universities. Some idioms connected to the salt covenant. The English word salary is derived from the Latin root word sal, which means salt. Salary literally means salt money. So when someone says you are worth your salt, they mean that you are worth your salary. At one point, salt was so valuable that the Roman army was paid with salt rather than money. If someone says you have everything hung up and salted, that means you know everything there is to know about that particular topic. Another phrase which is common is take it with a grain of salt. This actually means that the information you're hearing may not be entirely true. It alludes to the ancient Roman poison antidote, which usually included a grain of salt. And the next one, go back to the salt mines. This means resume your difficult and unpleasant work. More idioms connected to the salt covenant goes back to medieval times when you sat at a dinner table. Sitting closer to the master and mistress of the house was a place of honor, and then salt was placed in the middle of the table. So to sit beneath the salt actually means that you are placed furthest away from the master and mistress of the house. This was a very low ranking position. So to say that someone is beneath the salt is to say that they are inferior or of ill repute. And to sit above the salt means that you are seated at a place of honor near the master and mistress of the house. And this was a higher ranking position and reserved for those who had a higher social status. A common British idiom is to eat salt with, which actually means to be a guest at someone's house. Salt in the New Covenant. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 tells us that you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste or purpose, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and walked on by people when the walkways are wet and slippery. Mark chapter 9, verse 49 says, everyone will be salted with fire. Mark chapter 9, verse 50 tells us salt is good and useful, but if salt has lost its saltiness or purpose, how will you make it salty? Have salt within yourselves continually and be at peace with one another. That phrase, have salt within yourselves continually and be at peace, goes back to an ancient custom where if you have entered into a token of friendship or salt covenant with a person, you are to constantly renew that salt covenant while you are in that person's presence. So while you are together, you're to eat bread and salt with that person every 24 hours, at least once every 24 hours. So if you have newly entered into a salt covenant and you remain with that person for a specific period of time, as long as you're in one another's presence, you're to have salt within yourselves continually by renewing the salt covenant. This means that it's a constant reminder that you're not just friends, that you're covenant partners, that you're also family, and that you are to be at peace with one another. So that Mark 9:50 directly references that custom. Luke chapter 14, verse 34 states, therefore salt is good, but if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? And the last one, Colossians 4, verse 6, which I did already read, let your speech at all times be gracious and pleasant, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how to answer each one who questions you. That concludes part 1 of this Understanding the Salt Covenant. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Please join me for part 2, and I will see you on the next Table Talk with Torah.